Here's a tricky question for you. On your screen now, you have two Roman silver denarii. Both are the same weight, but one of them is a very high quality 90% pure coin, and the other one is a very questionable 50% silver. How are you supposed to know which is the good coin and which is the bad one? Both look perfectly good. Silvery, bright, very shiny, good size, no clippings. It's hard, no? It turns out the Romans had the same problem back when these were real money. It was tough doing business in ancient Rome. On one hand, you had people trying to scam you with fake coins, and on the other, you always had to keep a constant eye on the state, because it too had a long track record of scamming its citizens. So how did the Romans do it? How did they know how much silver really was in each of their coins? How did they protect themselves? It turns out your average Roman merchant had a lot of tricks up their sleeves. So join me in this video where I share with you the answers. You see, first of all, we need to understand two separate concepts: counterfeiting and debasement. These are two entirely separate dangers. On one hand, there's counterfeiting, which is when a criminal makes a fake coin, pretending it is official money. Take this coin of Emperor Posthumus here as an example. At first glance, it looks like a silver coin, but do you see these brown patches all over the coin? That's copper. Only the surface of this coin is made out of silver. This is an ancient counterfeit, and the precious metal surface is, as you can see, it is peeling away, revealing the worthless base metal core, which makes the majority of this coin. So what they did here was someone made a base metal coin, covered it with a thin silver skin, heated up, struck it, and tried to pass this on as real money. As soon as the first coin was invented, probably the second coin ever made was a fake of the first coin. That is not an exaggeration. There are plenty of counterfeits from the very first coins. And this was a widespread problem. Surviving documents from classical Athens already mention the regulation of marketplaces and the checks for plated forgeries, and even the presence of official testers walking around the merchants whose job was to examine coins, cutting them open, probably sampling one every X number of coins to see if the coin was plated. That's why we find so many Athenian coins with big cuts made on them. This was done by these testers to see if the coin was made out of good silver all the way to its core. If you were found with a plated coin and didn't want to give it to the authorities and you wanted to pass it on, you were to be whipped. And if you were caught making them, your punishment was death. Now, counterfeiting is relatively simple to understand, but things get really tricky when we go to the other scam, debasement. This was not a criminal making fake money. Debasement is the state itself reducing the precious metal content of its own official coinage. To understand this, we have to remember that ancient monetary systems, like those of Greece and Rome, for example, were of course deeply connected to precious metals. It's what backed the currency. But a coin was not simply valued as a lump of silver. This denarius of Hadrian, for example, you see on your screen, was not used in daily life as X grams of silver. It was used as 1 denarius. Its value came from the fact that the state itself issued it, and law forced people to accept it at this face value. So in other words, the coin had a face value, and that value could be higher than the raw market value for the silver that made this coin. This is what we call fiduciary value. And here's where temptation begins, because the state holds a monopoly over the issue of money. Not only that, it can force this money to be the only acceptable one in its territory. And once people accept the coin by face value, rather than purely by precious metal weight, the state can exploit this monopoly. It can reduce the percentage of precious metal in the alloy of its coins, while still calling it by the same name and expecting people to accept it at the same face value. That means more coins can be produced from the same amount of precious metals. This is essentially what we have here. This other denarius you're seeing here, it was struck under Emperor Septimius Severus in the beginning of the 3rd century AD, and it only has 50% silver in it, despite being also worth 1 denarius. Why did he do it? Well, this emperor came to power through a civil war, and he didn't have enough silver to pay for his armies. So he just reduced the amount of silver in his coins to make sure he had enough denarii to pay his soldiers. If we look at this morally, this is basically as questionable as the criminal making the counterfeits, because reducing the precious metal that backs the value of your coins is, well, it's fraud. But hey, when a private citizen does it, it's a crime. When the emperor does it, it's monetary policy. After all, who would you complain to if you were a private citizen about this denarius being only 50% pure? That's a scam, you're right, but who would you complain to? To the very same emperor who imposed this policy? Good luck out there. So how could you, a mere Roman citizen, defend yourself? Not only you had to have ways to find out what was fake and what was real, but you also needed to be up to date with how much the emperor was tampering with the coins and adjust your prices in accordance to how much he had debased it. Because let's remember, a denarius was just a coin. Pure silver was the real money. The first line of defense were simple tests. Pliny the Elder, in his book Natural History, tells us that Roman testers judged coins by weight, appearance, and even sound. Before resorting to poking into a coin and potentially damaging it, a merchant could begin with the basic physical properties of pure silver. For example, silver had a specific density. It's a fairly dense metal, much denser than copper, so a coin of a certain size was expected to feel and weight a certain way in your hand. People who handled money every single day knew what good silver looked like, its color, its overall appearance. A coin could also be dropped or tapped because silver has a characteristic sound, and sources describe testers listening carefully to the sound of a denarius. Pure gold, on the other hand, being very soft, could be tested by bending the coin. Now, none of these methods could tell you the exact percentage of precious metal, but these could help you at least escape from getting a fake. Let's go back to that plated Antoninianus of Posthumus for a minute. In this example, the copper core is already exposed, so the deception is obvious, but imagine this coin when it was new, before the plating started to peel off. Another clue people could use was style, visual style. Roman coins were official objects made by trained engravers working for an official mint, and people were used to seeing imperial portraits of a very particular style. Now compare this plated fake to an official Antoninianus of the same type. I happen to have in my collection an official issue of the exact same type that the fake tries to replicate, and as we can see, the difference is actually very clear. The portrait, the whole appearance of the official issue is superior to the fake. The forger was trying to imitate the official mint, but he simply wasn't as good of a die engraver. Maybe the fake could pass unnoticed if you made a large payment and it was mixed with other real coins, but if you tried paying using only this coin, I don't think you would have fooled anyone. Pliny continues by describing a more accurate way of assaying coins, with the use of touchstones. These were special, dark-colored stones with a natural, slightly abrasive texture on their surface. So they were able to remove a microscopic layer of metal from the coin surface when you rub the coin against it, leaving a streak of silver against this dark background. This tester could then compare that streak with streaks made from known good silver. If it was the same color, it was good silver. If it was darker, something was going on. Here's an example of another counterfeit. This is a fake denarius of Emperor Caracalla. This used to be a much more dangerous fake because, as you can see, the style and the portrait and the letters, they're basically identical to the real thing. But as you can see from its pitch black appearance, the metal is bad. This is copper. Today, all of the silvered surface that used to cover this coin is gone, but when it was new, this would have been a very dangerous fake. A touchstone could protect you against this fake, because rubbing through this thin silver surface would certainly reveal the scam in the final color. The streak left on the stone would not look like good silver. But touchstones too had a weakness. They tested the surface, not the whole coin. They could detect plated forgeries and coins made from an inferior alloy, but they could not give an accurate silver percentage. And here's where the Roman Mint, the one that was helping the emperor scam its subjects, used one of its chemistry tricks. There was a way to make a coin made from lower quality silver to make it look much better than it really was. It was called surface depletion. Here's how it worked. You get the blank of a coin, so the unstruck coin, made out of this inferior silver alloy. You heat it up, and then you cool it down by quenching it on some kind of acidic solution. The acid would react with the copper on the coin surface, leaching it out of it, leaving the coin with a thin surface layer very rich in silver. After striking, the coin looked like it was very high quality, despite its debased interior. The point was that the exterior looked fantastic, and this could fool the touchstone. This denarius of Septimius Severus here, and actually all of the coins of the rest of the Severan dynasty, they are perfect examples. It's real silver content, it's around 50%, but what you're seeing here, the outside layer, is actually 95% pure. If you rubbed this coin against the touchstone, it would have left like a wonderful bright streak. Now, the Romans were not stupid. They were used to the idea of the state messing around with coinage. This was not something that suddenly appeared in the 3rd century. The practice goes back at least to the late Republican period. A good example of earlier state-run scams are the famous legionary denarii issued under Mark Antony. These coins were official, but they were not as fine as the normal silver of the period. While regular Republican denarii could be around 97% silver, the Antony's coins were closer to like 85 to 90%. They also tended to be a little bit lightweight, as he tried to save silver during his civil war against Octavian. People must have noticed that his coins were inferior, because according to finds and treasures, mind you, treasures dated to 200 years after Mark Antony's time, we can still find evidence of his legionary coins in circulation. That was not an accident. Higher quality silver coins always disappeared faster because they were more attractive to hoarders. Inferior silver, like that of Mark Antony, stayed in circulation for much longer because everyone knew it didn't have the same intrinsic value. But of course, they had to have the means of finding out in the first place these coins were inferior. Therefore, if you were your average Roman citizen trying to run a business, you had to find a more accurate way of measuring coins in order to protect yourself. Roman merchants relied heavily on social networks. Associations of local merchants were common in any city with a minimally active commercial life. If you have the chance to visit the ruins of Ostia, the port city of Rome, there's this fascinating square full of mosaics, and each mosaic represented a different corporation. The corporation of shippers, of fishermen, of grain traders, of woodworkers, you name it. And one of the things these networks did for its members was to keep track of the quality of the coinage, so traders could protect themselves from debasement. When suspicion arose, coins could be taken to like metalworkers or professional testers for more detailed assays. The results would then be shared amongst traders, so no one would be left charging the same prices while accepting inferior silver. Of course, now we're talking about deeper, much more complex tests. There were two main ways to chemically test a coin. The simpler method was by heating, and this too is described by Pliny the Elder. A tester could take a slice from a coin, place it over a piece of white-hot iron, and then watch how it reacted. If the piece of the coin melted while remaining white and bright, that was the sign of good silver. If it turned black, it contained lead, and if it turned yellow or red, that suggested copper in the alloy. The more the color moved away from clean white and towards yellow and finally red, the less silver there was in the mix. This wouldn't give you a precise number. You couldn't say like, this coin is exactly 1 part silver for 5 parts copper, but it could dismantle this surface enrichment trick, and you could actually compare the molten coin against older coins, and by color alone determine if there was debasement happening or not. This was particularly important as the 3rd century progressed, because silver is much brighter than copper, and you could achieve a very white-looking alloy even with low percentages of silver. If we look, for example, at coins of the reign of Emperor Gallienus, particularly in his early reign, when these coins are mint state, they look fantastic, they look pure silver, but underneath, they're only 25% silver. It's actually incredibly impressive how they managed to make the coin look so good with so little silver in it. If I then compare these coins with a piece from a previous emperor, let's say Philip the Arab, here's a coin of his son, Philip II. Both coins look like they are pure silver, but the Philip here has 40% silver in it. That's nearly twice as much silver in this coin compared to the previous one. This was simply a superior store of value, despite in theory both Philip and Gallienus coin being the same face value. So here you can see very well why doing these tests was very important. If I was to commit the sacrilege of melting these two coins into little puddles of metal, the Philip one would have looked like a yellowish gray, while the Gallienus one would be more towards red. But then things got really complicated when each individual coin started having so little silver in it that not even the heating technique worked. So I just mentioned Emperor Gallienus. If we look at the coins of his late reign, the debasement situation got really ridiculous. Now what you're seeing on your screen is another Antoninianus of him, but this one is from the year 266. It looks like a pure copper coin, but it did have a little bit of silver in it. It also had a silver wash on its surface, but now there are only traces of it left. But this coin, despite its miserable look, still had a non-negligible content of like 3%, give or take. And what if we compared this one against a coin from his successor, Claudius Gothicus? His coins are even worse, 2% silver. But simply looking at these coins, you can't really see the difference. Both look like little discs of copper. And let's say we did the same heating up technique. The final result would be two little balls of red metal, so similar that you couldn't really come up to a conclusion of how much silver we're talking about here. However, we're not talking about a negligible difference in silver content. If one had 2% and the other one had 3%, that's a 50% difference. Fortunately, the Romans, always so creative, they had one last trick up their sleeve. There was a test called fire assaying. The chemical process behind this test is known today as cupellation. This was the closest the Romans could get to like a modern laboratory analysis. This was a destructive test that requires someone with actual like advanced knowledge in metalworking and a proper furnace. It worked like this. One or multiple coins were added to a crucible. The number of coins and their weight was noted. Then lead was added to the crucible and the whole thing was put in a furnace. Under strong heat and with the presence of oxygen, the copper and other non-precious metals, they stuck to the lead. Silver, being much less chemically reactive, did not oxidize in the same way. So after some time in the furnace, you were left with a mass of lead, copper, and whatever impurities were present in the mix, and a tiny little bead of highly pure silver. That 1-2% silver per coin we're talking about, this could be separated in this way. Of course, imagine how minuscule that bead would have been. That's why probably they used multiple coins in this test. That's what made the cupellation method so powerful. You were no longer simply judging the color of the final product. You were physically separating the silver from the base metal. Once the bead was left behind, it could be weighted and compared against the original weight of the other metals in the coin, and you could accurately calculate the exact percentage of silver within each coin. This kind of fire assaying must have mattered especially during periods of runaway debasement. Once again, looking at Gallienus, between the period of 260 and 268 AD, the Antoninianus rapidly collapsed in silver content, and reductions in silver actually happen on a monthly basis. So merchants, they simply couldn't trust the state. They could not assume that one official coin was equal to another one in metal value. Probably regular assayings became the only reliable way to track down how much silver was still left in the currency. Even the emperor himself and his staff had to rely on proper assaying during this collapse. At the beginning of Emperor Aurelian's reign in 271, his first Antoniniani were still miserable coins, around these 2% silver mark. But there was one famous coin issue, the Divo Claudio series. This was an issue struck under Aurelian, but it celebrated the deification of the previous emperor. There was something wrong with this issue. These coins contained no silver at all, only copper with a silvered surface. The workers at the Rome Mint were stealing the little silver that was meant to be put on coinage, and they were keeping it for themselves. Aurelian was not happy with this. Back in Rome, the mint workers, after finding out the emperor had uncovered their scam and was marching on Rome, they decided to rebel on what is known today as the Money Years' War. Aurelian just crushed the revolt, executed the mint staff, closed the mint of Rome for several years, and then carried out a complete monetary reform. Many of his new Antoniniani carried on the reverse a message, a mark, 20-1 in Roman numerals. So it meant 20 parts of copper to 1 part silver, or about 5% silver. It was not a return to pure silver coinage, far from it, but it was a public statement from Aurelian, something like, "This coin has a declared standard, I stand by it, I'm not here to scam anyone," and this was basically like a state trying to make the money believable again. Sadly, Aurelian forgot the second part of a monetary reform of such scale, which was to remove all of the mountains of bad coins already in circulation. So inflation continued very high during his reign, and pretty much for the rest of Roman imperial history, in fact. Better coins could help restore confidence, but they could not magically erase decades of fraud and the economic damage it all caused. But what fascinates me the most is this Roman multi-layered response to this problem. They were not passive victims. They weighted the coins, listened to them, scratched them, tested them on stones, heated their shavings, and when necessary, they were willing to destroy samples to assay the metal itself. This was a society without modern laboratories, but not without chemical knowledge and ingenuity. This whole situation just shows how resourceful and creative pre-industrial societies could be. This is what makes this topic so fascinating. The same ingenuity could be used to scam people or to defend yourself from being scammed. So at the end of the day, ancient coins teach us a very uncomfortable lesson. Technology may change, but people really do not. And you know what? I know what you should be watching next. In a previous video of mine, I explained how a Roman mint operated, how it was organized, how it operated. It's a fascinating episode you should watch. Alright, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Leave a like and consider subscribing if you did, and I'll see you soon. Let me give a special thank you to all of my amazing channel members and Patreons for their generous support. This channel would not be the same without your help. And if you would like to be part of this list, have early access to my videos when they are uploaded to YouTube, and a series of other perks, make sure to check out my Patreon page and my members tab on YouTube. Thank you very much.